house that help send messages around, and I actually don't even know how to turn my television on. That's not a joke, it's actually true. So which brings me back to the title, Why Aroused? So, I know, Abby, I'm looking at you because I'm going to get to that you came up with the title. What did you think about the title? But here's how we came up with the title of my book and how the word hormone came about. So in 1905, when this Dr. Ernest Sterling, a British scientist, came up with the concept that all these hormones, that this is what a hormone does. And before, you have to realize that like the adrenal guys didn't talk to the testosterone guys. It was kind of thinking like if you put neurosurgeons and dentists and told them they should be unified in one field. There was no reason to think pituitary researchers should be in the same field as testes researchers. So Ernest Sterling was the one that figured out, oh, this is how hormones work, they're all similar, but I need a name. And he did what doctors do. He said he needed something from the Greek. So he went to his friend, a University of Cambridge classicist, and said, give me a word that means to arouse. He wasn't thinking sex, he wasn't thinking all that stuff. He was thinking, what I guess most of us were thinking when we see the book, is arouse as an arousing cell receptor, an arousing part of the body. So his friend said, how about something along the lines of hormoa, as in, that's Greek for to arouse. So he gave a talk and he said, hormones, as we may call them, and the name stuck. One of his friends, doctors never agree on anything, so I guess when one doctor gave this talk at the Royal Society in London, said this is what we'll call them, then there were other people in the audience saying, well, I have a better idea, because they want to get the claim. So someone said, how about autocoid? Which is actually a good word. I mean, it would sound weird to say, oh my God, I feel so autocoidal today. But if we had been saying that for the last 100 years, it would sound normal. But autocoid means your inner drug, so it actually kind of is a good thing. But someone else said, how about we use hormone for things that excite, and kalon, which is also from the Greek, for things to relax, but that didn't catch on. So hormones became hormones. And then my book title, I don't usually say this, but Abby's in the audience. You want to just wave a little, Abby? So when I needed a good book title and I came up with some dreary ones, I think I said, I don't know, Abby, like hormone means to arouse, and I'm looking for a good book title. And so we went back to like the 1905 thing. Rather than saying I need something with to arouse, and these guys said hormones, I said to Abby, I need something for my hormone book, and it means to arouse. And she said, just call it that. So that's how it happened? That's how it happened. Because when I forgot, you sent me the email chain to prove that that's how it happened. And this isn't part of my talk, but she also named caramel soup the Ben & Jerry's ice cream.
Why don't you just make the whole talk about me?
Why don't we do that? But now it's also going to be about my students, so hopefully this will work. One of the things I want to, oh, thank you. So, I just told you that 1905 is when the field was launched, but like a lot of things in medicine, things happened earlier and people ignored them. So the next 3 minutes, can we make it loud? Okay. Yeah, take up the whole screen. And before we start, I want to give a little background. The next 3 minutes were two students of mine, Jessica Pevner and Catherine McGeoch, who, just to let you know, they're not filmmakers and they're not animators. They're going to be amazing doctors one day. But they did this great video for my class, and I'm like, hey, can you do something for my book? So this is one of the 3 videos they did. They cannot be here today, but Maya, Catherine's friend, and Kevin, Catherine's friend, are here to accept the award for the presentation of her video. So there's Maya and Kevin. And now, let's hit it.
Welcome to Highlights from Hormone History, a video series inspired by Randi Epstein's book, Aroused. The subject of this video is the world's first hormone experiment. Learn about it in under 3 minutes. In 1848, Dr. Arnold Berthold conducted the first genuinely scientific hormone experiment on 6 roosters in his backyard in Germany. Many scientists then were curious about the testicles, whether they contained vital juices, and how they worked. Could a testicle do its job if it were placed somewhere else in the body? Berthold cut a single testicle off two of the roosters. He cut both testicles off another two. In the remaining two, he did an odd testicle swapping thing, removing both testicles and reinserting one in the belly of the other rooster. Each ended up with another bird's testicle, in the wrong place. Here's what Berthold found. The testicle-free birds got fat, lazy, and cowardly. Their brilliant red combs faded and shrank. They stopped chasing female poultry. His unitesticle roosters were the males, or rather the cocks, they had always been. They waddled, puffed their chests, and lusted after the hens. On autopsy, he found the lone testicle swollen. He reckoned it had swelled to compensate for the missing one. But the most stunning finding of all, the discovery that should have shocked the testicle research world, was the result of the gonad switching. Berthold had wondered whether testicles could function from anywhere in the body. They did. He had implanted a testicle between the intestinal loops of a fat, lazy, castrated bird. The young rooster, only 3 months old, had nothing between his drumsticks but a lone testicle in his gut. Yet he turned back into a full-fledged hen chaser, red comb and all. Berthold repeated his testicle-to-belly switch with another bird, and the same thing happened. Berthold had assumed that when he carved his poultry, he would find a network of nerves connecting the displaced testicles to the body. Instead, he found the testicles were surrounded by blood vessels. He wrote up the first explanation of how hormones worked, writing that his experiment showed that the testes released a substance into the blood that was carried off to the rest of the body and reached a special destination. He was right. Hormones are released in one part of the body and reach a specific target like a well-aimed arrow from a bow. He didn't use the word hormone because it wouldn't be coined for another half-century. No one listened. The specialty of hormonal science could have started right then and there, but it didn't. Berthold's backyard rooster trial could have been the paradigm-changing experiment, transforming the way scientists looked at internal secretions. He published his insights. Then, without fanfare, he moved on to other projects. As Albert Q. Mazel wrote in The Hormone Quest, it was as if Columbus had discovered America and then went home to spend the rest of his life studying the streets of Madrid. Thanks for watching.
Sounds like a name of a cocktail. Okay. Better than not doing videos. That was a video plus a little 80s rock. So we heard about my grandma and saw the video. I want to tell you just a few other stories about hormones and history and our perception of them. Bear with me because I'm going to read 2 pages. And you're going to think, what does this have to do with endocrinology and hormones? But it does. I promise you will get there. On May 21st, 1924, 2 Chicago teenagers tried to get away with murder. Nathan Leopold, or Babe as he was called, was 19. Richard Dickie Loeb was 18. They were both students at the University of Chicago, born and raised nearby in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in town. That afternoon, they left their college campus, rented a car, and drove to the Harvard School, an elite private boys' school they had both attended. Then they waited. They schemed for months and thought they had covered every angle to avoid suspicion. They knew, for instance, not to drive Babe's red Willie Knight's car. That'd be a dead giveaway. They also rented a modest vehicle, choosing a blue one, and they lied to the Leopold's chauffeur, telling him the brakes on the Willie's Knight needed fixing. That way he wouldn't worry about the rental. They rented the car under a false name, and then they had this alibi about carousing all night, just in case they got questioned. Babe and Dickie were brainy kids. They had each skipped grades, started college by the age of 15. One of them was about to go to Harvard Law School, though murder would actually get in the way of that. And they were both novice killers, so they weren't as good as they thought. The boys had a short list of potential candidates, all sons of their parents' wealthy friends. They chose 14-year-old Bobby Franks just because he was the last one to leave school that day and was alone. They offered him a ride from the schoolyard and lured him in. And just so they said, so you don't have to walk home. Then they drove a few blocks and bludgeoned him to death. The corpse was found in the woods later that evening with a pair of expensive horn-rimmed glasses nearby. Cops traced the glasses to one high-end shop that had only sold 3 pairs. One belonged to Babe Leopold. Babe tried to explain it away as a coincidence. He's an avid bird watcher, he's there all the time, he probably just his glasses happened to fall off by the dead body, and no one wanted it. Anyhow, the cops didn't buy it. Soon enough, both boys confessed, each claiming the other was the ringleader. The families hired famed defense attorney Clarence Darrow. He's the lawyer that would go on to defend John Scopes in the famous trial for the teacher in 1925 who wanted to teach evolution to his public school students. For the Leopold Loeb case, Darrow turned to science too. His mission was not to prove the boys' innocence, they pleaded guilty, but to get them life sentences instead of the death penalty. The murder was quickly dubbed the crime of the century. Newspaper men staked out the home of the Leopolds and Loebs. They packed the courtroom. The case would, years later, inspire 4 films. One starring Orson Welles, another directed by Alfred Hitchcock, a few books, one some fiction, some nonfiction, and a play. But here's the driving question that was on everyone's mind. All the newspaper men, the doctors, everyone that was reading all this stuff. What compelled these 2 boys who had it all, education, connections, money, to toss it all away for an afternoon of gruesome adventure? What was the motive? The media stoked curiosity, and you can imagine, it was in all the tabloids what people were saying. Some people said, well, they were raised by babysitters, so they felt neglected. It was their mother's fault. That's why they became killers. Some people said it was because they were gay lovers. Maybe their homosexuality made them become killers. I'm not quite sure the link. And someone else said, well, maybe because they were petty thieves. And I think one of them had stole from a lemonade stand when he was little. Someone said that I guess the Jewish people in the audience will get it, that their families only went to synagogue on the high holidays. Maybe if they went more often, the boys would not become murderers. None of these whys and wherefores, not the mothering or the sex, all the pilfering or the synagogue, pulled all the puzzling pieces together. Yet there was one theory that appealed to doctors, lawyers, and a lay audience hungry for a scientific reason to explain deviant behavior. This newfangled notion that was just in the medical journals in the 1920s. The answer lay in endocrinology. Endocrinology exploded in the 1920s from an obscure science to one of the most popular specialties. And you have to understand what was going on then, that we had some wonderful advances going on. This was right on the cusp of isolating estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. It was also some really wacky times. You could go up to Kansas and pick out a goat and say, I like those set of balls, and have them implanted in you, and they were supposed to boost your libido if you were a guy. That was really popular. Then you could go to the store and get all these over-the-counter things that might have hormones in it or just might have nothing, and they, in one jar, it was supposed to cure constipation, cancer, low libido, menstrual cramps, so all sorts of weird things were going on then. The one person you have to know about, and for this chapter, for a murder, is Louis Berman. He wasn't at the court case, but he set the scene for why we're thinking hormones and murder. Louis Berman was a doctor in the 1920s. If he were alive today, he would have his own TV show and a gazillion Twitter followers. He was an associate professor at Columbia. He was a member of all the established elite. He published a slew of scientific articles. He even did something wonderful. He isolated the gland and the parathyroid hormones. That's what rings around your thyroid gland and has to do with calcium. But he was also a wonderful self-promoter and an audacious extrapolator, and he knew how to hobnob with all the literati then. He said things like this: he could look at you and know your hormone type. And he gave examples from the past. He said Abe Lincoln was a pituitary kind of guy, Oscar Wilde, thymus type. He had books, like diet books. I mean, we laugh now, we could probably go to the store now and get them. He had books to diets to balance your hormones. The public loved him. Margaret Sanger, the famous birth control person, she adored him. Doctors loathed him because they couldn't stand that there was this Columbia University professor who actually did something good, and then here he was becoming famous for all these wacky things. But he had this idea, whether he believed in it or not, is that what we should do is go to the schools when kids were younger, examine their heads. This was sort of something that was in one of the newspapers about it. You can examine a kid's head and be like, okay, they're a little too much pituitary, they're a little too little this. And remember, this is in the days before we could measure hormones. So he was making these statements without any way to measure hormones. And he said what we could do is then fix children when they were younger and come up with what he called the ideal normal. And for him, that meant tall and handsome and never having to sleep. He also said that women with irregular periods had masculine kind of ovaries, and they would be susceptible to this, becoming dominating and even enterprising and pioneering. So what does this have to do with the Chicago trial? People were believing this, that there were hormones that had to do with this. So the wealthy family of these killers, Clarence Darrow, also their lawyer, they got 2 doctors in, not so much leading doctors, but they got doctors who said they knew about hormones. They couldn't measure them, but they brought in an x-ray machine because you would sometimes see if like your glands splayed the bones around it. They also got something, and I can't pronounce, called a metallometer, like something that was supposed to measure your metabolism, and it was like this big clunky machine. And so it was all in the news. So these 2 doctors show up in the jail where the kids were, and they're like, people staked out, cameramen, everyone, well, probably not cameramen, but reporters with their notebooks in the bushes. Everyone staked out, trying to see what's going on. After days of interviewing and studying these kids, the 2 doctors came up with a 300-page, 80,000-word report. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is basically what it said. Babe Leopold had a calcified pineal gland. Dickie Loeb had multiglandular disorder. And basically the essence was their hormones made them do it. The judge said this, and I'm going to paraphrase because he said it in a more judgy kind of way of talking, but he said, wow, this is fascinating, endocrinology is a fascinating field, it's great, I'm loving all this going on, but it's not going to get these 2 murderers off the hook. So he didn't sentence them to the death penalty, but that had nothing to do, he said, with all this hormone stuff. It's because they were children. But they were each given life sentences plus another 99 years for the kidnapping. So life sentence for murder and 99 years. Dickie Loeb was murdered 9 months after he was imprisoned by another prisoner. Nathan Leopold, as any good psychopath would do, was released on good behavior after 34 years because he was the model inmate. He moved to Puerto Rico, he became a medical technician, he married Trudy Feldman, a doctor's widow, and he died in 1971, donating his body to science. But we'll never know whether anyone really did look at his glands and figure out if they were messed up. So that comes into sort of the huckstery part of the talk. I really want to talk about a true scientist, Rosalind Yallow, and she's from New York. And I emailed her kids. I wanted her son to be here, but he couldn't. He's away, and they know that I'm speaking about her. She's the one that, like my grandma, except she got the Nobel Prize. She was a really tough woman, and the more I read about her, the more she has had every right to be a tough woman. So Rosalind Yallow was from the Bronx, Jewish girl whose parents were immigrants who never graduated from high school. She went to Hunter, graduated tops in her class in physics. She said to her teachers, this is what I want to do, I love science, and they said, this is the 1940s, honey. Maybe they didn't say that. They said, how about become a secretary to a scientist? They really said that. That's what a woman with an interest in science should do. So she had nowhere to go. They weren't going to help her get into graduate school. So she did become a secretary to a Columbia University scientist, because then you could take free classes. And she figured she would just take for free more science classes. So while she was going to enroll in free science classes, her boss said, science, take stenography. That'll help you. Anyhow, her son said that his mother had no sense of humor whatsoever. But I think she did, because she eventually kept applying and begged deals. She eventually got into University of Illinois. This isn't the funny part, but she did get into University of Illinois to get her PhD in physics. And the funny part was that she had said to her biographer, they had to have a world war in order for me to get into graduate school. The only reason why she was accepted is there weren't enough men. It was World War II, and there weren't enough men to fill in a class. She got accepted to another university, and they called Hunter and said, she's a woman and she's Jewish. Are you going to guarantee that she can get a job after she gets a PhD? And Hunter couldn't say they could guarantee. They said, we can't guarantee, so they didn't accept her. But University of Illinois accepted her, and when she went back, after graduation, she went back to the Bronx, where she started a lab, and without going into all the science, but it is in the book in a very lively sort of way, what she did with Solomon Bersin, who did not get the Nobel Prize because he had died before that, is they figured out the technique to measure hormones down to the billionth of a gram. And I just want to say that I tell my students, and a few of them are here, thank you very much, I say don't ever use revolutionary when you're writing about medicine, because few things are revolutionary, and every doctor, oh, this was revolutionary, and all the awards is revolutionary. This was revolutionary. This was revolutionary. Before this technique in 1959, before the technique of radioimmunoassay, if you went to a doctor and you were too tired, or women with too much hair on their face, or you were gaining weight, your doctor kind of looked at you and thought, do you look hormonally off? They didn't measure at all. And then after their technique, that's when they could measure it to a billionth of a gram. And it's not just endocrinology. The same technique is used in more modern versions to isolate the HIV virus and AIDS, to do cancer marking. So anything that's too sparse to measure. The fertility business wouldn't be without her. Modern medicine wouldn't exist without this technique. So anyhow, so this would be, I would say, a real scientist, and she has every reason to be a little difficult. So let's see, do I want to... Okay, so here, this is not Jessica, this was something I found, so it looks worse than some of the animation of my students. But I want to save room for questions, and I just want to give a few takeaways, because I don't want you to walk away and think, like, what just happened? We learned about killers and this woman from the Bronx. So here's the takeaway that you'll get from the book, that there are very brilliant and compassionate endocrinologists and scientists that have done wonderful things to plant the seeds to grow into this wonderful tree of endocrinology. And at the same time, ever since this field started, there have been those happy folk who like to grab at that low-lying fruit and sort of extrapolate it way too far. So I'm hoping that at the end of the read, you'll be able to have some idea of what's the crazy stuff out there and what's real. Let's see, and a few other fun facts to take away. I do have a chapter, everyone that looked at me and said, or friends, oh, your book's about hormones, they think it's like a whole book about menopause. I guess I just look menopausal. I do have a chapter, but the whole book isn't about menopause. But here's a fun takeaway fact. Some scientists believe that the only other mammal to go through menopause other than humans are killer whales. I'm not sure I believe it, but I did at times felt like I had a lot in common with a killer whale. Testosterone. I do write about testosterone. Yeah, it does kind of sink down as you get older. But here's the deal. Low testosterone, if you're seriously low and you go back into the normal range, yes, you'll have a better libido, and yes, you'll have more energy. But you have to be seriously low. That means 2 blood tests by an accredited lab. So someone can draw your blood and say to you, oh, your testosterone's this or that, but they're just like, either not sending it to a lab or going to some wacky lab because they want to be able to prescribe you something. But there's an organization called PATH, P-A-T-H, and they are trying to really insist that we have standardizations, and you can actually go to CDC and you can ask, where are you sending this blood test to? It's always a good idea to say that. And if it's too low tests from an accredited lab, then if you go from low to normal, then you'll feel a lot better. There's a big normal range of testosterone, and if you're sort of in like the like middle to low, and then you go middle to a little higher, no, it's not going to make much difference, but you might have this placebo boost, or maybe just going around saying like, oh my God, I'm 600 and you're 400 might make you feel better. I want to get back to Rosalind Yallow just to end. So Rosalind Yallow was known that after she got the Nobel Prize, people say, oh, she always had to sign her name, Rosalind Yallow, Nobel laureate. And you know what? If you win the Nobel, you can put Nobel laureate. I mean, think about it now with email. People put every little thing that you've ever gotten in your signature. And people made fun of her for saying Nobel laureate. She could do that. They also said that she always wore a necklace that had her Nobel Prize. And her kids said that wasn't true, but in the picture I have her, she's wearing a necklace. But here's what the kids said was true. That behind her desk, she had this sign. To be considered half as good as a man, a woman must work twice as hard and be twice as good. So that, I know, people are nodding like, oh, I've heard that. But here's what she added to the sign. Fortunately. So now I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
If you have a question, if you could just give me a wave of your hand so that you can do it in the mic and everyone can hear your question.
And my daughter Martha.
I'm wondering how you like navigated sifting through like the BS-y kind of hormone research that's out there, like the placebo, I don't know, like the bullshit stuff you're talking about in the world of hormone versus like the actual science. Because is there enough science out there to like definitively debunk the crap? And then like in your research, how did you as a scientist and like someone with the knowledge like talk with someone who you were skeptical of in order to kind of figure out what's real?
That's a good question. Of course. My daughter, that's a brilliant question. So I think what she's getting at is, like, there's a lot of unknowns in science. So maybe these, like, people that I'm calling a quack actually are onto something and they haven't proven it yet. So I'm there. Like, maybe there is some stuff out there that we're saying is quack. Like, maybe if you, like, spray yourself with oxytocin, the guy at the bar next to you, yeah, he will get really into you and whatever. But here's the thing. If we don't know something, I think we should say it. I have no problem with someone saying, look, oxytocin is, you know, the love hormone. And there's hints that maybe it affects behavior. But you need proof before you sell an oxytocin candy and charge people a lot of money and say this is going to make you bond with the person next to you. So like the fascinating thing about science is like we never know. We don't know. I mean, everything I said now, I just would be spewing shit, and it's going to just change in 20 years from now. But that's the beauty of science is we don't know. I think the thing that makes here's something. If you want to be, I'll flip it around. If you want to make a lot of money and be a really good charlatan, this is what you have to do. You have to like get yourself a degree somehow that you can actually put a shingle up, and you have to be really definite. Because the problem with doctors is they'll say to you, we're not really sure, because that's what you learn in medical school. We're not really sure, but here's the best thing that I think you should do. But if you go next door to that other guy who charges twice as much, he's going to say to you since the 1920s, I know exactly what's wrong. Here's the diet you should go on, and I guarantee you will feel better. And then try this medication that I sell for this much money. So I think maybe that's the way to do it. If you want to make money, just give people simple answers that are yes and no. If you're on the patient side and you're going to be wary about some doctors, I would say go to the doctor that has a little uncertainty and admits that we're doing the best we can, but we might not be 100% sure. Did that answer your question? Just say yes. Just say yes.
Hi, I have a question. What would you say would be sort of the most significant non-charlatan advance, let's say, in the last 20 years? I mean, I know there have been a lot, but in your research, I mean, what were you really, wowed by in terms of the developments in the science?
In the last 20 years, I have an issue with that because I think like 20 years was like 1985. I have an issue with
Since 2000.
I'm kind of stuck in the 1980s, so like I didn't even realize that No, I think what's going on now, and what's fascinating, is that we're appreciating that hormones are intertwined with your immune system, that are intertwined with ways in terms of fighting cancers that we can understand. I'm not saying that like your stress hormone is going to give you cancer. I'm saying in terms of cancer treatments, I think we're also now, in terms of hormone therapy, we understand it so well that there are doctors now that are looking at people who have been treated for cancer and saying, let's figure out what's going on with your hormones after. So years ago, it was like, we cured you of cancer, and you might kind of feel miserable and never be able to get pregnant, and it might have just destroyed all these other hormones, but be thankful that you're cured. And now we're saying, okay, you've had this cancer therapy, the chemotherapy mucked you up, but now there's things we can do with hormones to say, let's try to actually give you a quality of life. So and there are endocrinologists that deal just with post-cancer therapy. So I think I think this has to do with where we're getting in the future in terms of it's not like hormones and the immune system and brain signals. It's how they interact with each other.
Thank you so much. You know, I think we're in the middle of an obesity epidemic in this country. And you know, that vicious cycle can be started with obesity, increased insulin levels, insulin that's really not working on the patient, polycystic ovaries, anovulatory cycles, etc. Have you had an opportunity to look into this in terms of obesity and the negative effects that it can have on hormonal output? Thank you.
Well, there's two things going on. Yes, we know that, and they've known this for years, actually, and I think we're still just trying to shine a light on it, that yes, it affects, as you just said. We know that obesity screws up your insulin system, and it probably screws up other hormones, and it does cause infertility in certain ways, and not just because of the fat itself. We also know now, and this was in the 1990s, which I think of as now, that the fat cell is an endocrine cell, which is kind of phenomenal because we used to think of fat cells as just blobs. I don't know, I have pictures like a chunk of butter or something in you, but it's actually an endocrine cell. So fat itself, too much, screws up the immune system because it is releasing hormones. The other thing on the reverse of that is that what we're learning now is that there are some people that have hormone defects. It's a minority of people. There are some people that have hormone defects that compel them to keep eating. And we know that these people, we now have treatments like leptin shots, and there's others in the pipeline, so that they can actually think about something else other than eating. And what this means is not that their metabolism's off, but it also shows how hormones are connected to behavior, because these people are not eating because they're not getting fat because just the way they metabolize it, they have this compulsion to keep eating. Whenever I talk about that, you know, you see someone who's like, oh, I'll get a pill and help me with that. You know, these are people, just repeat, with a rare hormone defect. So yeah, I think you can actually, I found this, I think you can find like the leptin diet book online. I hope the author isn't in the audience because I think it's kind of bullshit. But for those of us who don't have a hormone defect like that, we can't just go out and take a pill and make us less hungry, because the bottom line is sometimes we eat even when we're not hungry, and there's other things going on. But I do think we're seeing both ends of the spectrum, and we're learning more. Because of this research, we're learning more about the actual fat cell and what role it plays in the endocrine system.
Thank you. Very informative and very entertaining talk.
Thank you to my good friend.
So you no, I was just curious, you know, there's a big trend now for people that have quote unquote natural hormone supplements, and a lot of people think as they're going through menopause in particular that if they take sort of a natural estrogen that it's completely safe and perfect, and I was just curious about
natural. So this all began with well, I'll just say the bottom line is, like, the pharmaceutical industry actually has a lot of different ways you can get hormones, and all different levels of them. And not that I'm just giving this plug to the pharmaceutical industry, but we do something called the FDA, and there is quality assurance. And I guess from the 80s, there started to be this new business, and the reason why, we have something called compounded hormones. Compounding hormones means like somebody's mixing it up outside a drug company and making it from scratch. The reason why we have compounded hormones is sometimes there's people, or it's compounded drugs too. Sometimes there's people who can't swallow a pill. So the pharmacist will mix it up and say, I'll give it to them in whatever way so they can take it. Or sometimes there's people that might be allergic to one of the ingredients in the common pill. So it used to be that compounding hormones was this rare thing that was used. Somehow or other, in the 1990s, there was this loophole in the government that allowed compounded hormones not to have to go through the FDA. So there's no quality assurance. And I don't know why this took off, but someone must have had a great marketing idea to market compounded hormones as healthier and more all natural. So you can go to a place and they'll say, don't take this estrogen, get this compounded hormone, and in your mind you're thinking somebody is like stirring it up all naturally. The compounded hormone industry has taken off so much that some of those companies are just as big as pharmaceutical companies. They just don't have to go through that FDA thing and get quality assurance. So it's kind of buyer beware, and there's a lot of doctors in the Endocrine Society, and there's a lot of organizations that are trying to make it so that we have quality control on everything that we're selling.
Hi, Randi.
Hi! We got hot mitzvah together.
What I'm curious to know is what has to happen in society to bring more quality to hormone treatments and drugs. And I'm thinking of insurance reimbursements, or the fact that you can see ads all day and all night long for Viagra, but when it comes to women's treatments for sexual dysfunction or enhancement, it's almost considered porn and banned on television.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I was hoping someone would ask about vaginas tonight. Thank you. That's just a shout out. No, so, yeah, I was at a breast cancer meeting, and these doctors were saying that, again, what I was talking about now, that we're seeing side effects of some cancer therapies. So there are women that go into early menopause after breast cancer treatment, and they have pain on intercourse, and they have all these side effects, and their insurance won't pay for their estrogen creams, but yet, you know, some guy can say, I need Viagra for whatever reason. Well, we know what reason. Some guy can say he needs Viagra, and that's paid for insurance. Yeah, we just need more pressure. There's patient activists. I just wrote a story recently about the issue with insulin. I mean, there's people that cannot afford their insulin. It's nuts. I spoke to a woman who lives in England now, and she lives there for work, but she's now part of this global network of diabetics who are fighting for lower cost insulin. And she said, I feel like a medical refugee. She said, I can finally afford being a diabetic because I'm on the National Health Service and my insulin doesn't cost anything. Here in the States, if you don't have really good insurance, in order to have diabetes, you have to have really good insurance. You have to be really smart, because even with good insurance, you have to be able to call Medtronics and tell them, no, I know you only give one pump, but if that pump breaks, then I'm really screwed, and my kid won't get insulin for 3 days, and that's deadly. I need the backup pump. You know, so it's a full-time job. So I just think we need more patient activism, and just to get for lower cost and higher quality and access for people that need these drugs.
Hi, thank you for the really informative talk. So something that I found interesting was the way that you talk about how like science and medicine around hormones can be weaponized in a way. And I was wondering if, looking back, you've seen a pattern in how society, if in those moments when science is weaponized and it spreads, whether there's patterns you notice that society that made people more susceptible to that. Or on the flip side, if there was anything successful in fighting that disinformation around hormones.
Well, I think it's always been, and doctors have always worried about this. So, like, I found these letters written in 1911 that said, like, it's an endocrine orgy out there. They're ruining our field. And so it's always bothered doctors that things are taken too far. I mean, I always think things come down to doctor-patient relationships. If you feel that you can trust your doctor, if you feel that you can open up and tell them things, whether it's about sexual dysfunction after cancer, or whatever you're feeling, and you feel that your doctor is giving you the honest truth, then you tend to set up good doctor-patient relationships, and then people don't have to flock elsewhere to try to get the quick fix. But I think it's a really tough thing to combat, because I do think it's just so alluring if you're not feeling well to feel like, oh, the cure is in that bottle. And again, yeah, you can go through the history, and there's times, yes, when they blame women for like everything we do is because, well, it's your uterus is wandering around your body, which they actually did used to think. And we've tried so much to like put everything, there's a history of things that are, hormones that are considered manly are for like smart and domineering and sex drive, and like things that are considered female were like passive and I guess stupider and whatever. And I think that sort of lays the groundwork that's still out there